Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name's Andrew McDonald, and this is Text in the City, the series where we take books, plays, movies from the VCE English syllabus and talk them through with a bookish resident expert type person. And our bookish expert type person today is Emmett Stinson. Emmett is a lecturer in publishing and communications at the University of Melbourne. He's also the president of Spunk, which is an advocacy group that represents Australian small presses. And he's also an author in his own right. His collection of short stories, Known Unknown, was published a couple of years ago. Please welcome Emmett to the Wheeler Centre.
Thank you.
The book in question today is Graham Greene's The Quiet American, a fantastic kind of political thriller. And before we kind of get too much into the in-depth analysis and kind of essay writing out loud that we do at these sessions, Emma, I just wanted to ask you if you let's do a hypothetical.
Sure.
Where you're walking down the street and you run into a friend, and the friend says, "Hey, what have you been reading of late?" And you say, "Oh, The Quiet American," and the friend says, "Oh, cool. How did you find it?" What would you say?
Well, I'm actually not, on a personal level, a huge fan of this book, or even necessarily of Graham Greene more broadly, which, I'll just note. I actually like to think of Graham Greene as the world's greatest second-rate novelist, which is to say there's something... all of his books have something really kind of cheesy and that doesn't actually quite work in them. And this is true of The Quiet American as well, which has the worst trope of the cheesiest dime store detective paperback novel you could ever read, which is that it turns out that the perspectival character, who's the narrator, who's been talking to you the entire time, turns out to be the murderer. You can read any book on fiction writing, I'll tell you not to do this. It doesn't make sense. You can't be in a character's head and have them withhold something from you. It's really... It's kind of laughable in a way. However, somehow he makes it work in the book. Somehow the book kind of still is enjoyable despite this really, really cheesy conceit at the center of it that actually doesn't make sense in a way.
Who here today, just put your hands up if you've read The Quiet American. Okay, good. So you didn't just spoil the whole room. That's good to know. Most people have read it. What do you like about the book? What works? Why is this regarded by so many people as a classic?
I think what does work in the book are you have these kind of lovely types in Fowler and Pyle that I think are quite interesting. You've got, of course, the theme of sexual disloyalty, which is always a huge thing in Greene, and I think that's something that draws people in. And the other thing, I think what does remain interesting about this book are all the other things that he manages to add in, aside from this main plot that's quite small, that's quite thin and quite problematic as well. But all those lovely other little scenes, the lovely scene, and we can talk more about this, with the PR briefing with the general, the scene of going in the bombing run. Up in the north, the scene where Fowler comes and sees the lake full of bodies. Those kinds of scenes I think are really quite phenomenal, and I think those bits really do quite stay with you.
Certainly a book of, in many respects, a different age, especially kind of like when you talk about the political scene. The French are still colonialists in this book. How does the kind of novel appeal, and what does it have for modern readers? Well,
it's in a way, I think the appeal for modern readers is pretty clear in that what this book marks is it marks a transition between imperialism or colonialism in its traditional form and neo-imperialism. It marks the notion of French colonialism and by extension English colonialism, British colonialism, and then the transition towards an American kind of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, which we're still, I think, very clearly in the midst of. I think looking back at the last decade, it would be hard to argue that American neo-imperialism is dead. I wouldn't buy that anyway.
Yeah. It's kind of funny, like the book was published in 1955 when, it's only 10 years after the end of World War II, when the Americans were very much the heroes of the peace. In many ways, it's kind of more relevant now than it was back then when it was first published.
Well, certainly. In the sense that Greene is registering something that was completely new. That was before the U.S. had even, sort of officially entered into the Vietnam War, although they'd had people stationed in Vietnam starting around 1950. So,
yeah. Is it people say that it's an anti-American novel, and it certainly has anti-American sentiments. Do you think that's right? Is it anti-American?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Fowler's quite objectionable as well. And, there's also, yeah, I guess broadly, but I don't think anyone comes off very, very well in the book except the Vietnamese people possibly. And they're quite, some of the things that are said about them are quite horrible as well. But, Fowler's a really problematic character in all kinds of ways, is immoral in all kinds of ways. And there's that lovely scene at the end where he goes to take, towards the end of the book, where he goes to take a different apartment, and he goes in to see this apartment that's owned by an old colonial who's got this massive collection of erotic art, and it's this kind of horrible, stifling, kind of disgusting picture of this old colonial Englishman. And so, I don't think England necessarily comes off a whole lot better either in the novel. So, I guess if you want to pick fights about those kinds of things, sure, but I don't think anyone comes off very well.
Yeah. Let's talk about the three main characters for a little bit. Obviously, Fowler is the English, and he's and each of the three main characters has a very obvious representation of their home country. Phuong is obviously Vietnam, and the quiet American, obviously. Does it work that it's so obvious that they're all supposed to be the countries that they represent?
I think Greene has always tended towards melodrama. I think all of his books have a very melodramatic aspect, and I think that's fine. And I think things are a little bit more. They're a little bit more complicated than that as well. I think to some degree because. You can read the characters as being a synecdoche, as standing in a part for whole kind of way for the larger countries, and they do up to a point. But at other points, that starts to unravel. If you start to look at the full complexity of Fowler and Pyle's relationship, the way that Fowler, basically sets up Pyle to be murdered and those kinds of things, you can't really connect that back to the nationality. So I think it works in that it breaks down, which it should do. It doesn't just stay in that kind of simple, static way of being able to say, well, Phuong is Vietnam, and how do you deal with the fact that Phuong loves popular movies? How does that as synecdoche for Vietnam? Well, I don't think it is necessarily. There are ways you could read it that way, but
I've also heard the character of Phuong kind of read as, she's so quiet and passive because that's how Vietnam was in the kind of midst of the turmoil and the wars and the Indochina kind of conflicts going on. Is that your reading, or is Phuong a bit of a cop out in that she's a female character that Greene was maybe just uncomfortable writing too much about?
I think it's difficult. I think it would be easy to accuse Greene of all kinds of stereotyping throughout the book. I think that's true to some degree of the British characters and of the American characters and of the Vietnamese characters. And there are, if you're reading things from a critical perspective, where you're critical of Orientalism, of the tendency of Western writers to portray people from the Orient as being somehow inscrutable or mysterious or passive or quiet. Well, Greene is absolutely guilty of all of those, those kinds of things. So if you want to read it in that mode, I think you can accuse him of that. However, from Greene's perspective, he might have just felt that as an Anglo-European, for him, he might have just thought that he really wasn't very qualified to get into the head of a young Vietnamese girl. He might have just felt that it wasn't really his place to do that, and it's hard to disagree with that as well. And to some degree, I think the representation of Phuong is a representation of the way that both Pyle and Fowler see her as well. So I think that the whole book is mediated through Fowler, and it would be, in a way, Fowler does seem to quite genuinely love Phuong in the kind of limited way that he can. But it would be quite weird if Fowler did have more insight into Phuong, because it would be out of character for him. So, again, I think you can argue it one way, but I think you can make a very strong case that it would have been quite unrealistic for Greene to do anything else with her.
It's in many ways a simple story. It's just a kind of straight out love story. Yeah. With the sexual betrayal that you mentioned before, which is everyone likes to read about sexual betrayal from time to time. Does the simple kind of fact of the narrative does that, you call it cheesy, but does it kind of help Greene do other things with the book?
Well, I don't have a problem with the plot, in as much as it's about sexual betrayal. And I think I think there are bits that are. I think there's a very melodramatic aspect to the novel, which just is what it is, you know. What I think is interesting about the book, and I mean, in this I'll note, you know, Greene was very, very heavily influenced by the writer Joseph Conrad as well. And in this book, in The Quiet American, he employs the trope of an unreliable narrator in the character of Fowler. And this is heavily influenced by the character of Marlowe in Heart of Darkness in particular, who is another character who mediates everything that we see, but is deeply unreliable himself. And it deals with the books deal with very similar themes, particularly the issues of colonialism and of European characters coming to terms with the reality of the effects of colonialism, particularly with the reality of the way that their privilege is based on, you know, the exploitation, horrible exploitation of other people. So, I mean, I think to me what works in the book is using this figure of Fowler as a flawed looking glass through to the world. And I think one of the things to me that's interesting about the book is, in a way, what the simple plot does is it enables us to spend lots of time in Fowler's head looking at things. And I think that's interesting, because I think Fowler is a character that we don't hopefully identify with, really, that we're not quite sure about, you know. And Greene is signaling this from the very beginning by making it clear that Fowler is an opium smoker from the very beginning, which is that has a very specific connotation in the Anglophone sense, going back to Confessions of an Opium Eater, and then the sort of notion of being addicted, and, you know, going back to Samuel Coleridge, of being someone who doesn't quite see the world as it really is, in a way. And
even though you want to keep liking Fowler, you keep trying to like him. Yeah. And then Greene just keeps putting things up which stop you from doing that. Like that awful scene when after the tall kind of house is kind of pulled down, and you can hear the other soldier, and he's like, oh, he's still alive. And then he dies, and he's happy that he dies, not just so he's not being bothered by that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Fowler's got a very cynical and very negative take on the world as well, to his own detriment at points. You know, I mean, he's unable to kind of articulate his own feelings for Fwang in any kind of positive terms, even though they clearly exceed the kind of negative terms that he uses to describe them. So I think there are all sorts of ways that he's made unlikable and problematic. What's interesting, though, is seeing these, you know, kind of these horrible events through his eyes, I think. And I think that's still interesting now, because it actually does give you a sense as well of, I think looking back to a more colonial mindset, it's hard to understand it for a lot of people now. Neo-imperialism is more complicated, I think. But I think it's hard to get back to that mindset. But I think the characters in this book kind of show the limitations of the Europeans who are engaging in these acts as well, and foreground those. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, the Americans are interesting in this book as well. So we obviously have Pyle, but there's also the character of Granger, who's the kind of loud, over the top, kind of obscene for the most part character. Yeah, and he kind of comes back in the second last chapter, and it's quite obvious that Greene is bringing him back for a particular reason. What does that character, like, we've obviously got Pyle, and he's, you know, the main representation of the states. What is Granger there for?
Well, in a way, I mean, I think Granger complicates the picture of the U.S. because there's this notion that Pyle is sort of idealistic and, you know, kind of sweet and, you know, untainted, but it's a dangerous sort of idealism. And actually what Granger shows is that there's another face to sort of U.S. foreign policy that's actually brutish, aggressive, cynical, you know, world weary, and maybe not as different, even though it's I think quite disgusting to Fowler, not quite as different from past mentalities as Fowler might like to make them, the distinction.
It's interesting to kind of think about the book in terms of kind of modern American foreign policy. If I guess students are, you know, thinking about the book and thinking about what they might be writing in essays kind of later in the year about the Quiet American, are there certain points of kind of modern American foreign policy that you draw?
Well, European foreign policy, I mean, I think it's very interesting to look at what's happened at places in the Middle East right now, and in relation to York Harding's Third Force. You know, it's very interesting to look at what's happened in Libya with the appearance of rebels that are, that have sort of freed that country and got arms from where? Who armed them? So we still have governments manufacturing third forces all across the world. So it's very relevant in those terms.
I guess Egypt as well, where these kind of extremist political parties look kind of set to win democratic elections. Not that the states would be happy with that at the moment.
Yeah, I think it'd be very interesting to see what the U.S. Response to that is. But yeah, that kind of York Harding idea that's characterized in the book is a very common method in the U.S. I mean, if you look back at Afghanistan and the Taliban, who were the U.S.'s enemies, except in the 1980s when they were the Mujahideen and the allies of the U.S. against the Soviet invasion. So this is a very standard.
York Harding is interesting. He's the only author that the American reads. What kind of role is he in the novel?
Well, I don't actually know enough about the York Harding aspect, and I don't know if he's based on someone, but you've got to imagine that he's got to be, because of course Graham Greene was reporting for Life magazine and the Sunday Times in the 4 years leading up to the publication of this book. He was in Indochina and in the East reporting, and York Harding is characterized as this kind of intellectual who flies in for a week, goes to have a drink at a few bars, talks to a few people, and then creates an elaborate theory on how to solve a situation, and it's readily dismissed. And one just imagine, I would presume that to some degree this was influenced by Greene's own experience of going over and probably meeting guys like York Harding who kind of just come in and think they can figure out all the problems of another nation in a few days.
Yeah, I think it's quite telling as well that Pyle reads only York Harding.
Only York Harding. Yeah.
It kind of makes you want to kind of go back and read Graham Greene's kind of initial reporting that he did from Indochina and kind of read what he was reporting on at the time. Do you think that it kind of reads as a book of the author's experience kind of reporting?
To be fair, I actually don't think it does, really. And it's kind of surprising when you look at it to find out how much of the material was really autobiographical. For example, that great scene with where Granger kind of tricks the French general into admitting how bad the situation it is. Apparently, and I haven't read the original, but apparently that's virtually a word-for-word transcript from a debrief that Greene was at, and it's really, really close to something that actually happened.
Really? Wow.
Which is kind of amazing. And again, I haven't read the original, but apparently it's very close. And if that's the case, it's kind of hard to believe, because it's one of those things that when you read it, it seems like a manufactured scene. It seems like it couldn't possibly be real, and yet apparently, it's actually very close to something that occurred.
Yeah, some of the writing is so beautiful, like the scene where the big explosion kind of happens in the climax of the book, and it's kind of so beautifully written, and it seems so real and exactly as you would experience if you were Fowler, that you kind of almost kind of think that maybe Graham Greene was involved in a similar type explosion.
Well, but the explosion one is a great example, and it's a great example of how Greene blends things, which there are actually important bits of that are taken from Heart of Darkness. One of the key scenes after that explosion is that Pyle has blood on his shoe, which is this when the riverboat in Heart of Darkness is attacked and Marlowe goes through that, he gets blood on his shoe as well and throws it away. So there's even that kind of thing that actually lingers between them, and the kind of approach to the scene of the explosion in the book, which is a very fragmented set of experiences for Fowler. He doesn't it's not like there's a camera sitting out there sort of recording every detail. What's interesting about that description is the way that we're really put into Fowler's point of view, and we really get a sense of what we can't now. And there's a famous scene again in Heart of Darkness where the riverboat's attacked, the one that I'm referring to, where you get the same thing from Marlowe. It's really mediated by his limited perspective, and so to me that's an interesting one where it feels exactly like an event that's there, but I actually think it was probably more influenced by a work of fiction written 40 years before than something he'd actually experienced there in that regard.
It's pretty hard to kind of get to the end of either book, Heart of Darkness or The Quiet American, and not feel pretty depressed and pretty kind of,
they're not happy books.
The theme, I guess there's like a number of themes in the book, and they're pretty kind of obvious, but kind of fascinating and wonderful to talk through as well. But the theme about communication, I think, is one that's maybe not picked up on as much, but it's really interesting. And when you kind of look at each character has a problem communicating that's kind of unique to them and them only. So Granger, for example, is just loud and boisterous and completely over the top, and the quiet American, obviously. And Fowler is kind of very he holds himself back and he's reluctant and he doesn't want to go to the press conferences. And Fong as well, she very rarely kind of answers one of Fowler's questions directly. Obviously done on purpose.
It's huge, and translation has made a huge issue of as well. I mean, there's that scene where you get Fowler translating between Pyle and Fwong, as Pyle is basically trying to propose marriage to Fwong and steal her away from Fowler, and you get Fowler there translating, which is ridiculous. You get the scene I talked about earlier, the press conference where you've got the French general who admits to how poorly the war is going. The great bit in that scene is at the end when he admits to everything, he says it all in English and then turns to his translators who are meant to be translating from French into English. But the general has spoken English and then says to the translators, now translate that back into French for the French papers, and storms off. So there's this sense of, the notion of translation and of language more generally, and switching between languages is some kind of barrier as well. And you get that with Fowler, who's constantly flipping between French and English. And then there's even the issue when Pyle shows up of, not only of not knowing French, but not knowing French the way the Vietnamese speak French as well, which he points out will cause a whole other set of problems. So
you do get the feeling that Greene is kind of very clearly saying, you guys are not listening to each other well enough. You're not paying attention properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the suggestion as well is that, that listening is very difficult, and you'd have to be a polyglot. You'd have to know lots of languages to be able to do it. And even then, you still might not be able to. So,
yeah. We're going to open up for questions in just a few minutes. So if you have them for us, we'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on the book and throw a question Emmett's way. That'd be great. So while you're thinking of those, I want to hit on one of the kind of big themes of the book, which is the idealistic and kind of naive character of Pyle, and kind of how destructive that is. I don't think I've read many books really where kind of naivety and innocence has been made out to be such a destructive force. Yep.
Apparently this is an idea, and I haven't read this again, that's actually taken from Conrad's Under Western Skies, just interestingly. Apparently there's a very similar set of characters in this regard. But yeah, no, I think that is one of the things that's really interesting about the book. I mean, there are other books that deal with kind of notions of American innocence as not being innocent, and one of the most famous, provocative, and problematic ones would be Nabokov's Lolita, which deals with these issues as well, I think, in a very different way, in a very different context, of course. But that's also about some of these issues. Not in relation to, of course, colonialism or neo-imperialism. At the same time, there's a question of what's really motivating Pyle, because he seems innocent in a way, and he is innocent in a way, but then after the bomb, after all these people die, Fowler questions him about it, and Pyle says kind of very callously, well, they died for democracy, and so there's this sense that he's maybe quiet and maybe innocent on the one hand, but he seems to lack a kind of really basic empathy on the other, and he seems so driven by a kind of ideology that he actually ceases to be human.
And that's kind of there when he first confronts Fowler about wanting his girl as well at the very start of the book. Absolutely, as if you could just go and state this kind of boldly to someone that you consider a friend, or not a friend for that matter. So there's something really quite ridiculous about Pyle in that regard. But Fowler, I mean, is quite ridiculous as well. He spends 190 pages in the book seemingly trying to absolve himself of a certain kind of guilt, and he works very hard to justify his own actions, which are very hard to justify. Which you can see a lot of in his kind of pursuit of the divorce with his wife.
With his wife as well is the same thing, and with he's left a wife and a mistress behind named Anne also. And there's a sense that even though he's kind of been freed at the end of the novel to pursue a new marriage, that, he ends up saying that he wished he had someone to apologize to, but he can't find the person. He's still living in this kind of fallen and sort of trapped sort of state.
Yeah. Do you find it to be an anti-war book?
It's complicated, and I think one of the things that is difficult about this book, and I think it's one of the reasons I think the book has endured, is that I think it's difficult to pin down, except at very specific points, exactly what the author thinks, and that's because I think it opens itself. It opens itself up in a way because it's a dialogical novel. By dialogical, I mean it's got a lot of different characters in it who've got different viewpoints, and they're all speaking at each other. And it's really hard to assess who's right and who's wrong. And the narrator doesn't. The narrator himself is unreliable in the case of Fowler, and it's really left up to the reader to assess who's right and who's wrong in discussions. So it results in what's known as a dialogic indeterminacy in the book, where it becomes difficult to tell who's got a privileged speaking position. And so, I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting in the book is you can actually make really good arguments for really contrary positions. And contemporary reviewers did. A lot of people just slammed Greene for being anti-American, which I think is broadly true, but kind of wrong, really wrong in sort of the spirit of the book. And, Greene has also been accused of being, it's been accused of being an anti-war novel and of a novel that kind of, that in some way sort of weirdly praises colonialism as well. It suggests that the old model of colonialism was somehow maybe nicer than the neo-colonialism that's developing. So, it's a really weird book. It's a book that you can kind of read a couple contradictory ways in that regard.
It's fascinating. It's similar to Heart of Darkness in the way that they both kind of convey the horror of the experience of the thing, but don't really give you any kind of straight up answers at the end.
No. And, a lot of people have attacked Heart of Darkness as well by saying it's a novel that attacks colonialism, but it's still a novel about, kind of a central white European male in Africa. So it's still kind of privileged. It still puts that figure at the center of things. Yeah. The horror can only be registered in someone from Europe coming over, not someone who's actually experiencing the brutality of colonialism. So, even that's a book that's been attacked as conservative in some ways.
Yeah.
So.
Do we have any questions from the audience for The Quiet American for Emmett?
At the end of the novel, Granger's son has polio and Granger becomes humanized, and then 2 pages later we get these kind of 2 throwaway lines. Suddenly Granger's son is better and Granger's drunk and happy. Why does Granger's son need to be better? Is that just for the sake of the happy ending, or does it add any kind of symbolism?
That's I haven't thought about that, but there are a couple different points in the book, and it's another thing that I find a bit weird, where you get characters who are introduced and then dispensed with. Fowler gets, I'm going to forget his name at the moment, an Indian kind of personal assistant at one point who comes in for kind of 2 pages, and then he gets sick, and then he kind of disappears and only comes in at other points. So there is this weirdness in the book of getting those characters come in and not. You could read that as being, if you wanted to read it in a certain way, as it being a redemptive sign and a suggestion that Fowler has been sick, that he's trying to get well, that the marriage and this move to that. So Fowler is someone who's remained unattached and undecided always. He says he doesn't want to have any political affiliations. He's just there to observe. He doesn't want to take sides. And one of the suggestions at the end of the book is that in becoming married, he's kind of taking sides. He's kind of committing. He's moving towards a better place. And you could read that as being in some way in sympathy, with this kind of move towards a very quiet note of possible improvement at the end of the novel.
It certainly humanizes Granger.
Enormously.
Even the audience, you're like,
enormously.
I've rushed too quickly to assume this guy was just a pig.
Yeah. Although he may, in fact, still be a pig as well. That's one of the difficulties, like, again, with the book.
Yeah.
Just a humanized one.
More questions? If I'm kind of looking to write an essay about The Quiet American, what do you think are the kind of the go-to themes that you'd be hitting up?
I think the political context stuff is very interesting, and it's very much foregrounded in the book. I think there is again, there's issues that we've talked about in relation to colonialism, of an older mode of colonialism conflicting with a new mode of colonialism, and the nation that gets stuck in the middle between 2 other countries, kind of fighting over this sort of turf, and the French and the Americans. Although it's kind of through Fowler as an Englishman who represents the sort of French.
Do you think it's a good book to discuss in the context of the Vietnam War? Because it does kind of, it's prophetic in many cases. It is prophetic in many
cases, and it's hard to know. I mean, the Vietnam War is a complicated thing. It was a really long war. People forget the Vietnam War is the longest war that the United States was ever in. The U.S. first sent troops into Vietnam in 1950 and didn't withdraw them until 1975. So even though there's not a declaration of war in the traditional sense, if you're actually talking about military action in an extended period, it's the longest U.S. military action. So I guess it depends on what you mean by, it was a long, really complicated war. So yeah, I think yes, you can talk about it in those terms. I mean, I think philosophically it's quite interesting as well, from a certain perspective, particularly the perspective of kind of ethics, the idea of how one should act or how one should live in the world, because I think there are a bunch of different concepts of ethical being that are suggested in the novel. You've got Pyle, who believes in adherence to an idea, which is this notion of democracy as he sees it, and a kind of deontological ethics, an ethics that should be guided by a rule, a concept, something he believes in, versus you've got Fowler, who's kind of got this idea that you shouldn't get too involved in anything, and getting too involved is damaging. So almost what's ethical for Fowler is to kind of withdraw from the world and let things take their course, which is quite strange. And then that, of course, changes over the novel as he becomes involved. So I mean, I think those are quite interesting issues to look at.
What are the ethics of the Vietnamese in the book?
Well, that's unclear. I mean, the closest you get to that is what's suggested by Fowler, which is that these are people who basically don't have basic autonomy. That these are people who want to know when the next harvest is coming in and want to be able to plan for their lives and go about things, and they can't because foreign powers keep intervening. That's about as complex a message as I think we clearly get through Fowler, but that's complicated by characters like Phuong, who's very interested in Western movies, for example, as well, which suggests that there are other desires beyond just living the way that maybe people in the country have lived in a traditional sense.
Yeah. She's for kind of the few words that she spoke, she's one of the characters that I wondered about the most at the end of the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
More questions, yeah.
Hi. What is it that you think Fowler sees in Phuong? Why is it that they're in a relationship?
It's difficult because you've got what Fowler says about it, and Fowler's kind of claim is that he loves Phuong precisely because she didn't need him the way that other people have, So it's almost her detachment from him that he kind of loves, and he sort of argues that that they work because they live together well, and that there's almost not this sort of passionate attachment. But do we trust Fowler? I don't know. I don't trust him. It's hard to know from other context clues in the book what it is that keeps him there. And there's a bigger question. And again, if we're looking at Phuong as a synecdoche, as a representation of Vietnam itself, there's this question of what it is about Vietnam that keeps Fowler there, and there is another suggestion, which is a suggestion of pleasure, that Fowler and Phuong's relationship gives him an enormous amount of sexual pleasure as well, and being in Vietnam also, Fowler does smoke opium, which he seems to quite enjoy. So there may be some baser aspects that are keeping him both in Vietnam and with Phuong as well.
It seemed to me that kind of what he wanted Phuong for changed over the course of the novel.
It does change. Yeah, I'd agree. It
started off very much in the kind of like he just wanted her for the sex, but kind of towards the end of the book, there was like a companionship kind of element to what he wanted from her.
Absolutely, and I think even early on, I think he told himself that. I don't think that was true. In fact, I think until Pyle shows up and tries to take Phuong from him, he doesn't really realize what he had with Phuong. He doesn't start the process of trying to marry Phuong until he really realizes that that Pyle's going to come and try and take her away. So, I think the relationship changes, but I think it's also an issue of Fowler not really of taking things for granted as well.
Question down the front.
You're quite scathing of Fowler. I'm just wondering, he's a man who's seen lots of conflict. You don't think that perhaps he has regrets, but that as the reader we sort of identify with him, that there are times that we should have done something or intervened in conflict that we didn't? Do you think that Greene wanting us to identify with him in some way?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think certainly, again, if you look at kind of stereotypical representations of English people, I mean, I think this is one way in which Greene is, I think Greene plays into stereotypes, but I think he does it for everybody, which is lovely. Which is kind of the stereotype of the sort of withdrawn, emotionally distant, unattached sort of Englishman is a definite stereotype. And so, I mean, I think given Greene's audience, there's definitely an attempt to appeal. I don't know if that translates as seamlessly to a contemporary Australian audience, but I think we can still identify with that. And in Fowler's case, he does ultimately have to take a side. He does realize that he can't stay detached forever, and that's one of the things that humanizes him. And again, I think I like that notion before of talking about Granger and humanizing him. I think it's important to note that we can humanize a character without liking that character, and I think that's the case with Fowler. I don't necessarily particularly like Fowler, but I can understand that he's a human being, and I don't think he's an awful sort of inhuman, unfeeling character. I just think he's a deeply flawed one, but one that that is genuinely human and does want to do the right thing ultimately.
It's not exactly a life-affirming novel. I felt by the end of it that it was anti-American, anti-British, anti-Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Any more questions out there? Yep, one at the very back.
Could you talk about conflict inside The Quiet American?
Sure. Just to specify, when you say conflict, do you mean armed conflict or conflict between characters or
whatever conflict that there is in the book?
Okay.
Which would you prefer to hear about? Emotional conflict or the armed conflict?
Conflict that I can write in my essay at the end of the year.
Well, I think they're linked. I mean, I think that's one of the nice things in the book, and we've talked about that a bit already, which is that I think the conflict for sort of domination over Vietnam between explicitly between the French and the Americans is represented in the conflict over form between Pyle and Fowler to some degree. It's about an old colonial order yielding to a neo-colonial order. So there's that nice mapping of the one onto the other that's already been mentioned. But one of the other things that I think that is interesting about the book, and again, it's something that I think Greene did really take from Conrad, is the way that the actual conflict in the book doesn't happen the way that we get conflict in like action movies, now. It's always really distanced and impersonal and kind of fragmented and weird. All the scenes that actually represent conflict are like that. You've got the scene that we haven't talked about, with Pyle and Fowler in the tower, and even the moment that Fowler's injured running away from that, it's really a distance. They don't see anybody. They're hiding. It's heavily mediated by pain. It's not a heroic kind of conflict, really, in the kind of way that we think about it. It's not people sort of rushing into battle and courageously giving up their lives. It's bombing people at a distance. It's using bicycle bombs to blow things up and attacking women and children. So one of the other interesting things is the very notion of conflict in the novel is heavily de-romanticized. It's heavily de-romanticized. It's suggested that it's quite a kind of brutal and fragmented thing and not really a sort of heroic process. So.
It's interesting. We haven't really touched on the fact that the Pyle does save Fowler's life, and kind of how little is made of that. It kind of happens, and then we kind of move on, and it's not, that's not romanticized either. It's
not, and in fact, Fowler's quite clear that he didn't really want Pyle to save his life. In this regard, so he almost takes a page or so to like work out whether he is grateful or not, and decides that he's not. He really does. He does sit on the fence a bit, so it's hard to know. Yeah, it really warms that character to me. I'm like, well, I mean, you're a nice guy, aren't you? Greene also came from it's worth noting Greene grew up at a time when the model for the understanding of the human self was Freudian psychoanalysis. That was absolutely the paradigm. So the notion of what in Freudian terms is thanatos, or the death drive, that people literally have a will towards destroying themselves. That's something that a lot of people firmly believed, and I think Greene's book, whether or not he was a Freudian, reflects these kinds of principles that were out in the culture at the time too. So.
For the Graham Greene fans, are there other books kind of similar to The Quiet American that you'd recommend?
Well, it's typically seen that there's a big division in Greene's work between his early novels and his sort of mid-period novels starting. So you've got the early novels that are kind of considered the Catholic novels, and then there's a division as well. And I haven't actually read a lot of Greene's later stuff. I've read The Comedians, which is kind of from this, often paired with The Quiet American, and which to me is not Greene's strongest novel. I actually quite like The Heart of the Matter, which is seen to be quite a different sort of book altogether. It's also very kind of stifling and depressing, though, and so has a kind of ill-fated love story and all that. So.
Yeah. How do you think a writer like Greene kind of decides after visiting a place and having the experience? How does he go, fiction or non-fiction? Do you have any insights into that?
He sort of talked about it and just said, well, in the way that other people would kind of collect their pieces of non-fiction together into a book of essays. I'd just write a novel. That was sort of his claim, which sounds a bit too modest. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is I think people are always very influenced by what they've read, and I think Greene was obviously interested in kind of political intrigue and secret agents and things like that. And I think he read a lot of fiction that reflected those interests, and so he kind of wrote about it and fictionalized it.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions about The Quiet American before we get close to wrapping up? No questions at all. I just want to ask you one more thing, and that's about the French and the way that the French are represented in the book, and they're not nowhere near as much as the kind of Vietnam, America, and England. But I guess the detective Vigo is the kind of the main kind of Frenchman that we kind of hear from, and he's kind of distrusting of it seems to me everyone, mostly Fowler. Like, is that kind of like a too simple way to look at the way that the French have been represented in this book?
It's difficult. I mean, a lot of people have read Vigo as well as being a sort of a stand-in for a priest, that he's the kind of the sort of confessor that's pushing Fowler to kind of admit to his sin. Vigo references Pascal at one point, and Pascal had a famous thing known as wrote a famous philosophical experiment called Pascal's Wager, which was sort of an argument about the existence of God and belief in the afterlife in particular. So Vigo is often seen as kind of filling that role and pushing that even further. Some people have argued that at the end, when Fowler says he wished he had someone to apologize to, but there's no one there, that the sort of the unnamed person to apologize to is God. In fact, that that's kind of the suggestion, is that part of Fowler's fallen state is because he can't sort of accept the reality of anything beyond the material world.
Would you go as far as to say that Vigo is the moral compass of the book, if there is one?
Yeah, he is, because he's the person who's ultimately holding Fowler to account. And who knows that Fowler is involved in some way, even if he can't prove it. So, yeah, in that sense, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, well, it's a fascinating book. Thank you for coming and hearing us talk about The Quiet American. Please put your hands together for Emmett, our resident expert.